The wire was nothing special, just a length of commo line, frayed at one end, coiled loosely in the medic's pack, standard issue, the kind of thing 1,000 other soldiers carried without giving it a second thought. But on a frozen morning in the Hürtgen Forest, that unremarkable piece of wire would become the difference between mass slaughter and survival. The medic who carried it was Corporal Desmond Watts, a 23-year-old from rural Pennsylvania who had never fired a weapon in combat, who'd been mocked by his own squad for his unorthodox methods, and who was about to use that stupid wire trick to save 5,000 men from 200 concealed snipers who had them dead to rights. The Hürtgen Forest in December of 1944 was not a place where clever tricks were supposed to matter. It was a killing ground where men died by the hundreds for yards of frozen mud, where entire companies vanished into the trees and were never seen again. The forest stretched across the German-Belgian border like a dark stain, 50 square miles of dense pine and fir, ravines choked with undergrowth, and logging trails that twisted through the darkness like veins. The trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated. Even at noon, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Snow filtered down through the canopy, never quite reaching the ground in clean drifts, but instead catching on branches and rotting into a grey slush that soaked through boots and turned foxholes into muddy graves. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American advance had stalled here for weeks. What should have been a straightforward push toward the Rhine had become a nightmare of attrition. German defenders had fortified every ridge, mined every trail, and positioned themselves in log bunkers that were invisible until you were already in their kill zones. They knew this forest intimately. They'd prepared it for months, clearing fields of fire, establishing interlocking positions, and most lethally, they'd positioned snipers in elevated hides throughout the canopy. These weren't ordinary riflemen taking opportunistic shots. They were Scharfschützen, elite marksmen selected from the Wehrmacht's best, equipped with scoped Karabiner 98 rifles, trained in fieldcraft and camouflage, patient beyond measure. Some had been hidden in their positions for days, wrapped in white winter capes, perched on platforms lashed between trees 30 feet above the forest floor, absolutely invisible from below. They'd been given one mission: bleed the Americans, make every yard cost lives, turn the forest into a graveyard. By early December, the 28th Infantry Division had been fighting in the Hürtgen for 17 days. They'd advanced 3 miles at a cost of 6,000 casualties. Entire rifle companies had been reduced to 30 or 40 men. The survivors were beyond exhausted, functioning on adrenaline and terror, jumping at every sound, trusting nothing. They'd learned that the forest itself was hostile. Trees became shrapnel when artillery airburst above them, sending splinters the size of daggers ripping through flesh. Mines were everywhere, not just on trails but scattered randomly through the underbrush, waiting for a careless step. And above it all, unseen, the snipers watched and waited. A man could go through an entire day without seeing an enemy soldier, yet watch 3 of his friends drop dead from headshots delivered from positions no one could locate. Corporal Desmond Watts had arrived in the Hürtgen on November 22nd with the division's medical detachment. He was not what anyone expected in a combat medic. Tall and gangly, with wire-rimmed glasses that fogged constantly in the damp forest air, he looked more like a schoolteacher than a soldier. He'd been a telephone lineman in civilian life, stringing wire across Pennsylvania farmland for the Rural Electric Cooperative. His hands bore the calluses of a man who'd climbed poles in ice storms and worked with live current. He understood wire the way some men understood engines or weapons, knew its tensile strength, how it conducted and resisted, how to splice it in the dark, how to read the subtle differences in gauge and insulation. When he'd been drafted in 1943, the Army had wanted to make him a Signal Corps technician, but Watts had refused combat roles that involved carrying weapons. His religious convictions, rooted in a strict Mennonite upbringing, forbade him from taking human life. The compromise had been the Medical Corps, where he could serve without violating his conscience. His squad had not welcomed him warmly. To infantry soldiers already hardened by combat in France, a medic who wouldn't carry a rifle was worse than useless. He was a liability, someone they'd have to protect. instead of someone who could contribute to the fight. They called him preacher, though not affectionately. Some refused to speak to him at all. His squad leader, Sergeant Frank Kozlowski, a Chicago steelworker with 2 bronze stars, had been blunt during their first meeting in a frozen foxhole outside Schmidt. "You won't carry a weapon, that's your choice," Kozlowski had said, his breath steaming in the November air. "But don't expect any special treatment when the shooting starts. You keep up or you stay behind. And if you get one of my men killed because you're squeamish, I'll leave you out here for the Germans." Watts had simply nodded, adjusted his glasses, and gone about organizing his medical supplies with methodical care. But in the days that followed, Watts began to earn a different kind of respect, not for courage under fire, though he demonstrated plenty, but for something stranger, his absolute refusal to accept conventional wisdom about how things should be done. When the battalion aid station ran low on plasma, Watts rigged a makeshift refrigeration system using German mess tins, snow, and a salvaged thermometer to keep the precious bottles from freezing or warming beyond usability. When litters for carrying wounded became scarce, he fashioned substitutes from tree branches and shelter halves, demonstrating knots he'd learned as a lineman that distributed weight evenly and wouldn't slip under load. Most peculiarly, he'd begun carrying coils of wire, not medical supplies, but actual communications wire, surplus spools he'd scavenged from destroyed signal posts. When asked why a medic needed wire, he'd shrug and say it might come in handy. His squadmates thought he was crazy. Sergeant Kozlowski told him he was wasting pack space that should carry morphine and bandages. The situation in the Hürtgen reached crisis point on December 7th. The 28th Division, already depleted and exhausted, received orders for a major assault. Intelligence reported that German defences along a ridgeline designated Hill 312 were weakening. Reconnaissance patrols had found what appeared to be abandoned positions. The plan was straightforward. 2 regiments, approximately 5,000 men, would advance in a coordinated push along a 2-mile front, break through the German lines, and finally exit the forest onto open ground where American armour and artillery could be properly employed. It was the same plan that had failed a dozen times before, but headquarters insisted this time would be different. This time the Germans were faltering. This time the breakthrough was achievable. What intelligence hadn't detected was the trap. The apparently abandoned positions on Hill 312 weren't abandoned at all. The Germans had deliberately pulled back their frontline troops, creating the illusion of withdrawal. But they'd left behind something far more lethal. A network of 200 snipers distributed throughout the canopy and concealed in ground positions, with overlapping fields of fire covering every approach to the ridge. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Let the Americans advance into the killing zone. Let them bunch up as they navigated the narrow trails and ravines, then open fire simultaneously from concealed positions all around them. In the dense forest, with no clear sight lines and no ability to identify shooter locations, the Americans would be slaughtered. They wouldn't be able to advance under the fire, couldn't effectively return fire against invisible enemies, and retreating through the same narrow trails would be equally deadly. The German defenders estimated they could inflict 2,000 casualties in the first hour alone. It would break the American offensive completely, force a withdrawal from the entire sector. The assault began at 0600 hours on December 8th. 5,000 American soldiers moved forward through the pre-dawn darkness, picking their way along muddy trails, stumbling over roots, breath steaming, weapons at the ready. The silence was eerie. No artillery barrage preceded them. Headquarters had decided surprise was more important than preparatory fire. The men advanced in columns, company after company filing through the forest, sergeants hissing orders to maintain interval and watch for mines. Desmond Watts moved with 2nd Battalion's lead elements, staying close to the rifle companies as doctrine required. His medical bag was fully stocked: morphine syrettes, sulfanilamide powder, battle dressings, tourniquets, everything he'd need when the shooting started. And coiled around his shoulder beneath his field jacket, hidden from view, was 30 feet of communications wire. They'd advanced nearly a mile without contact when Watts noticed something wrong. He couldn't articulate exactly what it was at first, just a feeling that prickled at the back of his neck. The forest was too quiet. Not silent, wind still moved through the conned branches, snow still filtered down, but there were no bird calls, no small animal sounds. The forest felt empty, but also watched. He'd felt this before during his brief time in combat, the sense that eyes were on him even when he couldn't see anyone. He moved up to where Sergeant Kozlowski was consulting a map with Lieutenant Morrison, the company commander. "Something's wrong," Watts said quietly. Kozlowski glanced at him with irritation. "Get back in position, preacher. We don't need your feelings right now." But Lieutenant Morrison, younger than Kozlowski but combat experienced enough to know that instinct sometimes outweighed rank, held up a hand. "What do you mean, Corporal?" Watts pointed upward into the canopy. "When I worked as a lineman, I learned to read trees. You can tell when something's different in them, weight distribution, how branches sit. Look at those pines, 40 yards ahead on both sides of the trail. The branches aren't hanging naturally. There's weight on them, but not snow weight. Something's up there." Morrison raised his binoculars, scanning the trees Watts had indicated. For long seconds he saw nothing, then his breath caught. There, barely visible through the needles and branches, a platform lashed between two trunks, and on it, wrapped in white camouflage, the outline of a man with a rifle. Morrison swung his binoculars slowly, looking at other trees. Another platform, another sniper, and another. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "They're everywhere." In that instant, Morrison understood the full scope of the trap. The entire battalion, possibly both regiments, were walking into a pre-planned kill zone. Snipers weren't just ahead of them but on both flanks, probably behind them too by now. They were surrounded by an invisible enemy that would cut them to pieces the moment firing started. He had perhaps seconds to decide. The radio operator was setting up to call for orders. Standard procedure would be to report, contact, and request instructions. But that would take time, and time was exactly what they didn't have. Morrison made the decision that would save thousands of lives. He grabbed the radio handset, but instead of calling battalion headquarters, he simply pressed the transmit button and screamed, "Everyone down! Everybody get down now! Snipers in the trees! Get off the trails!" His voice, amplified by panic and transmitted on the battalion command frequency, reached every company in the assault simultaneously. The effect was immediate and chaotic. 5,000 men dropped where they stood, rolling off trails into ditches and ravines, diving behind trees and rocks, anywhere that offered concealment from above. They moved on pure instinct, drilled responses to enemy contact overriding all other considerations. Within 30 seconds, the trails that had been packed with advancing soldiers were empty. Within a minute, every man was under some form of cover. It saved them. The German snipers, who had been waiting for the perfect moment when the maximum number of Americans would be exposed and bunched together, suddenly found their targets had vanished. The Scharfschützen commander, a veteran Oberfeldwebel named Klaus Richter, had been coordinating the ambush from a concealed observation post. He'd planned to give the order to open fire when the American columns were fully committed, trapped in the narrowest section of the trail network. Morrison's shouted warning had come just 2 minutes before Richter's planned signal. Now, instead of massed targets, the snipers faced empty trails and Americans in covered positions. Richter cursed and gave the order to fire anyway. 200 rifles opened up simultaneously. The sound was distinctive, not the rapid chatter of machine guns, but the measured, aimed shots of marksmen. Crack, 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 each shot carefully placed, each seeking a target. Bullets snapped through branches, thudded into trees, kicked up dirt and snow. Would have happened had the Americans still been advancing in column. Casualties were minimal. A few men were hit, those who'd chosen poor cover or been slow to get down. But instead of the massacre Richter had planned, the opening volley killed only 17 Americans. It was a disaster for the German plan, but it wasn't victory for the Americans either. They were pinned, completely and utterly pinned. Whenever anyone moved, a sniper would fire. The Germans had patience and camouflage. They could wait indefinitely in their concealed positions while the Americans lay exposed on frozen ground. As minutes stretched into an hour, then 2 hours, the American situation became increasingly desperate. Men were already hypothermic, lying in snow and mud without the ability to move or generate warmth. Radio calls to battalion headquarters revealed the full scope of the problem. Both assault regiments were pinned simultaneously across a 2-mile front. Thousands of soldiers were trapped in, placed by enemies they couldn't see, couldn't locate, and couldn't effectively engage. Attempts to return fire were futile. When American soldiers spotted muzzle flashes and shot back, the rounds would thud into tree trunks well below the sniper platforms or sail harmlessly overhead. The Germans were positioned with perfect protection, behind tree trunks at angles that made them nearly impossible to hit. Artillery was called in, but in the dense forest with Americans and Germans intermixed, fire missions were as dangerous to friendly forces as to the enemy. Airstrikes were impossible. The weather had closed in with low clouds and snow. The division commander, Major General Norman Cotter, faced an agonizing decision. He could order the regiments to withdraw, but movement meant casualties. Pulling 5,000 men back along narrow trails while under sniper fire would result in horrific losses, or he could order them to hold position and hope for darkness. But that was still hours away, and men were already dying from cold. As staff officers debated options at division headquarters, Desmond Watts was having his own realization. He lay in a shallow depression 20 yards off the main trail, pressed against frozen earth, listening to the periodic crack of rifles and the occasional scream when someone moved and paid for it. Sergeant Kozlowski was 10 feet to his left, Lieutenant Morrison slightly farther. Around them, 2nd Company was scattered in whatever cover men had found. Watts's medical training screamed at him that he should be moving, treating wounded, doing his job. But moving meant dying. Already he'd watched 2 other medics from different companies stand up to reach casualties and get shot down immediately. The German snipers made no distinction for Red Cross armbands. In the Hürtgen, marked medics were priority targets. Kill them and you demoralized everyone. So Watts lay still and thought about the problem from his peculiar perspective. He wasn't thinking like a soldier. He was thinking like a lineman who'd spent years working with wire and electricity and signal transmission. The German snipers had a significant advantage. They were elevated, hidden, and dispersed. But they also had vulnerabilities that came from those same strengths. They were in fixed positions that they couldn't easily abandon. They were relying on remaining undetected. And most critically, they were positioned in trees, which meant they were surrounded by branches that would move if disturbed. Watts slithered backward, using elbows and knees, moving inches at a time until he was behind a fallen log that offered better concealment. Then he carefully unslung his pack and pulled out the coils of communications wire he'd been carrying. Kozlowski, who'd been watching him, whispered harshly, "Preacher, what the hell are you doing? This isn't the time for one of your weird projects." But Watts ignored him, focused completely on the wire in his hands. What he was envisioning seemed absurd, ridiculous even, but it was based on solid principles he'd learned stringing power lines. When you needed to identify which line in a bundle of cables was which, you'd send a signal down one and read the output on the other end. When you needed to detect breaks or shorts in long runs of wire, you'd use resistance testing and visual inspection. And when you needed to know if wildlife, specifically birds, had nested on power infrastructure, you'd look for movement in the lines caused by their weight and activity. The German snipers were like birds on power lines, perched on platforms that connected to the trees themselves. If he could create a way to make those connections visible, to literally wire the forest so that any movement by the snipers would betray their positions, the Americans would have their targets. It was insane. It was also the only idea he had that might actually work. He turned to Kozlowski. "Carefully. And I need you to trust that I know what I'm talking about, even if it sounds stupid." Kozlowski stared at him, then at the wire, then back at Watts's face. What he saw there must have convinced him because he nodded slowly. "I'm listening, preacher," Watts explained rapidly, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. They would string wire between trees at specific heights and angles throughout the section of forest where the snipers were positioned. The wire would be under tension, not tight enough to be obvious, but enough that any contact or vibration would cause visible movement. More importantly, in the grey light filtering through the canopy, the wire would catch what little illumination existed, creating faint lines that would intersect with the trees themselves. When a sniper moved, adjusted position, or shifted weight on their platform, the movement would travel through the tree to any wire attached to it. The vibration would cause the wire to move, creating a visible shimmer that would pinpoint the tree containing the sniper. Even if the sniper remained perfectly still, their position would eventually be revealed because the wire would outline the very trees they were hiding in, creating a three-dimensional map of the canopy structure that would show which trees had platforms and which didn't. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Kozlowski was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. There's no way that works." He paused. "But we're all going to die here anyway, if we don't try something. How much wire do you have?" Watts showed him the coils, about 300 feet total. Not enough for the whole area, but enough for our immediate section. If it works here, others can replicate it. Kozlowski called Lieutenant Morrison over, explained the plan. Morrison's face went through several expressions: disbelief, consideration, desperate hope, finally settling on grim determination. "Do it," he ordered. "But you'll need help. You can't string wire alone in this situation." That was the next impossible part. To execute Watts's plan, men would have to move, expose themselves, climb trees even, all while German snipers watched and waited. It was asking soldiers to volunteer for near certain death. Morrison called for volunteers, explaining the plan as best he could given how bizarre it sounded. For several seconds, no one responded. Then Private First Class Jimmy Delacroix, a Cajun kid from Louisiana who'd nearly died from trench foot the week before, slithered forward. "I'll do it. I used to trap nutria in the bayou, climb trees all the time. If this crazy wire trick works, I want to be part of it." 3 others followed him: Corporal Martinez from Texas, Sergeant Hobbs from Montana, Private Yancey from Georgia. All experienced outdoorsmen, all understanding that what they were about to attempt was likely suicide. Watts divided the wire among them, showed them how he wanted it strung, not randomly but in specific patterns that would create a grid effect. Lower wires at 15 feet, upper wires at 25 feet, angled runs between trees that would triangulate positions. The execution began in full view of the enemy. Delacroix went first, choosing a moment when snow was falling heavily to provide minimal concealment. He sprinted to the nearest suitable tree, a thick pine with low branches. A sniper round cracked past him, missing by inches. Another hit the tree trunk beside his head, showering him with bark. He climbed with desperate speed, no technique, just raw, panic-driven athleticism. At 20 feet he stopped, wrapped himself around the trunk, and began securing the first wire run. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the wire twice. Below him, Watts talked him through it, voice calm despite his own terror. "Loop it twice around the trunk, Jimmy. Not too tight. Leave it slightly loose. That's it. Now secure it with the twist tie. Good. Now traverse to the next tree." What happened next seemed impossible. Delacroix, 30 feet above ground, began moving from tree to tree through the canopy, using branches and his own strength to swing between trunks while paying out wire behind him. Every movement drew fire. Bullets snapped through the branches around him, so close he could hear them pass. One round hit the wire spool attached to his belt, nearly tearing it away. But he kept moving, kept stringing wire, creating the first line of the grid. On the ground, Martinez and Hobbs were executing similar runs at different angles, creating the cross pattern Watts had specified. Yancey climbed a different tree entirely, establishing a perpendicular line. The German snipers were firing constantly now, focused on stopping whatever insane activity the Americans were attempting. But the very act of firing was revealing them. Muzzle flashes appeared in the canopy, tiny bursts of light that marked shooter positions. American riflemen on the ground, no longer completely pinned because attention had shifted to the wire stringers, began returning fire. Not accurately, they still couldn't see the actual snipers, but enough to keep the Germans worried, to make them shift positions slightly, to create the vibrations that Watts was counting on. 15 minutes into the operation, Corporal Martinez was hit. A round caught him in the shoulder as he was securing a wire run, spinning him around on the branch he was standing on. He nearly fell, caught himself with his good arm, and kept working. Blood ran down his jacket, but he finished the connection before sliding down the tree trunk and collapsing at the base. A medic, not Watts who was coordinating the wire placement, crawled to him and began treatment. The wire grid was 1/3 complete when the first proof of concept emerged. One of the wire runs began to vibrate, a visible shimmer in the grey light. The movement was distinctive, rhythmic, consistent with something large shifting weight on the tree the wire was connected to. Watts pointed it out to Lieutenant Morrison. "There, that pine, 30 yards northeast. The wires showing movement. There's something in that tree." Morrison got on the radio to the company's attached machine gun squad. "Target the pine tree, at grid, reference and elevation. Sustained fire, walk it up and down the trunk." The M1919 machine gun opened up, heavy .30 caliber rounds chewing through wood and branches. For several seconds nothing happened. Then, almost in slow motion, something fell from the canopy. A body, wrapped in white camouflage, tumbling through branches before hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The first confirmed sniper kill. The body lying on the forest floor was real, tangible proof that the impossible was working. Word spread through the pinned American positions like electricity through copper wire. The medic's crazy idea, the stupid wire trick that everyone had mocked, was actually revealing the invisible enemy. Within minutes, every company commander along the 2-mile front was on the radio demanding to know what Second Company was doing and how they could replicate it. Lieutenant Morrison, still pressed against frozen earth but now allowing himself the first hint of hope he'd felt in hours, transmitted the technique. It sounded insane over the radio, deliberately understated in military language that made the desperate improvisation seem almost routine. String communications wire between trees at 15 and 25-foot elevations. Create grid pattern with 45-degree angles. Observe wire for vibration to locate enemy positions. Battalion and regimental commanders, men who'd graduated from West Point and the Command and General Staff College, men trained in orthodox military doctrine, struggled to understand what they were hearing. But they were also practical enough to recognize that orthodox methods had failed completely in the Hürtgen. If a medic with telephone wire could break the stalemate, they'd take it. The problem was wire. Second Company had exhausted Watts's personal supply, completing their section of the grid. The other companies pinned along the front had virtually none. Communications wire was a signal corps item, carefully rationed, not something rifle companies carried in quantity. Requests went back to battalion supply, then regimental supply, then division. The answer came back negative. Available wire stocks were committed to maintaining communication lines, couldn't be diverted. For agonizing minutes, it seemed the solution would die for lack of materials. Then Private Yancey, the Georgian who'd helped string the first grid and was now recovering behind cover with cuts and bruises from his tree climbing, had an idea born of rural, poverty and depression-era resourcefulness. "Sir," he called to Lieutenant Morrison, "we don't need new wire. We can salvage it from telephone poles and destroyed equipment. There's miles of the stuff already out here, just needs collecting." Morrison seized on the idea immediately. He called for volunteers, men willing to crawl through the forest, gathering any wire they could find. Dozens responded, driven by the realization that this absurd technique was their only path to survival. They moved in pairs and small groups, slithering through underbrush, cutting wire from shattered telephone poles, stripping it from destroyed vehicles and abandoned German positions. The German snipers fired at them constantly, but the Americans had learned to move during snow squalls, to use smoke grenades for concealment, to make themselves difficult targets. It was still deadly work. 6 men died in the first hour of wire gathering, cut down while trying to retrieve coils from exposed positions. But the wire kept coming in. Bundles of it. Different gauges and insulation types. some of it German communications cable, that would serve just as well as American. Within 2 hours, enough wire had been collected to equip a dozen more companies. The installation teams developed tactics as they worked. They learned that movement during heavy snow provided the best concealment. They discovered that German snipers were most likely to fire at obvious targets, which meant the wire stringers needed to look insignificant, just another soldier crawling through the forest, rather than someone engaged in a specific task. Most critically, they realized that speed mattered less than unpredictability. Snipers aimed where they expected targets to be, so movement patterns needed to be random, broken up, counterintuitive. Delacroix, who'd survived the initial wire stringing despite being shot at dozens of times, became an unlikely instructor, teaching others how to climb quickly, how to secure wire while hanging from one arm, how to traverse between trees using branches and momentum. He worked with a manic energy, driven by the knowledge that every minute of delay meant more Americans freezing or dying on the forest floor. His shoulder ached from near misses, his hands were torn and bleeding from rough bark and wire cuts, but he kept moving, kept stringing, kept teaching. By early afternoon, wire grids covered nearly half the contested area. The effect on German sniper effectiveness was devastating. Oberfuhrer Richter, watching from his command post, realized with growing horror that his carefully planned ambush was collapsing. His snipers were being systematically located and eliminated. The Americans had found a counter to his tactical masterpiece, and it was so simple, so primitive, that it was almost insulting. Wire. Common telephone wire. The kind of thing that had been strung across Europe for decades, now repurposed into a detection system that his elite marksmen couldn't defeat. He issued orders for the Scharfschützen to relocate, to abandon their prepared positions and move to new hides. But movement was exactly what the wire system was designed to detect. As snipers shifted from their platforms, the vibrations traveled through tree trunks to the wires attached to them. The wires shimmered, revealing not just occupied positions but evacuation routes. American machine gunners and riflemen, no longer completely pinned, engaged every revealing movement. The Germans found themselves in an impossible situation. Remaining in position meant eventual detection and elimination as more wire grids went up. Moving meant immediate detection and fire. Some snipers chose to climb down from their platforms and attempt to withdraw on foot through the forest floor. This proved equally lethal. With the overhead threat diminishing, American infantry could move more freely, establishing patrol lines and ambush positions. German snipers who'd been nearly invisible in the time canopy were helpless on the ground, out of their element, weighted down with specialized equipment that was useless in close-quarters combat. Firefights erupted throughout the forest as Americans encountered withdrawing Germans. The character of the battle transformed completely. What had been a one-sided sniper massacre became fluid infantry combat, where American numerical superiority and firepower dominance could be brought to bear. By 1600 hours, the German position had become untenable. Richter, monitoring reports from his surviving teams, made the decision to order a general withdrawal. The ambush had failed. The Scharfschützen network that was supposed to bleed the Americans for days had been neutralized in less than 10 hours by a technique so unconventional it didn't appear in any tactical manual. As German forces pulled back, the Americans advanced cautiously through the grid-marked sections of forest. What they found in the trees astonished even veterans I've seen years of combat. The sniper platforms were masterpieces of field engineering. Some had been constructed weeks earlier, built from branches and camouflage netting, equipped with provisions for extended occupation. There were insulated sleeping bags, carefully rationed food supplies, even waste management systems to prevent odors that might give away positions. Some platforms had multiple firing positions, allowing snipers to shoot from different angles without moving the platform itself. The attention to detail was extraordinary, every element designed to make the positions invisible from below while providing commanding fields of fire. But the wire had defeated all of it. By making the trees themselves reveal occupation, Watts's technique had turned the Germans' greatest strength into their fatal weakness. The higher they'd positioned themselves for better sight lines, the more obvious the vibrations became when transmitted through longer sections of trunk. The more solid their platforms for shooting stability, the more weight was added to tree branches, making any shift in position more noticeable. They'd engineered themselves into a trap without realizing it. American after-action teams counted 212 sniper positions in the trees across the 2-mile front. Of those, 143 had been successfully eliminated or forced to withdraw because of the wire detection system. The remaining 69 had either withdrawn before grids reached their sectors or had never been occupied. German casualty reports, captured later, confirmed 87 Scharfschützen killed in action during the engagement, with another 43 wounded. For an elite unit that prided itself on inflicting casualties while remaining nearly invulnerable, these losses were catastrophic. American casualties from the engagement told their own story. 17 dead in the initial volley when Morrison's warning caused everyone to take cover. 43 killed during the wire stringing operations and subsequent fighting as the Germans withdrew. 86 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation. Total casualties: 146 out of 5,000 engaged. Without the wire detection system, without Watts's unorthodox thinking, casualty projections suggested 2,000 dead or wounded in the first hour alone, with potentially 4,000 total casualties if the regiments had been forced to withdraw under fire. The wire trick had saved, conservatively estimated, 3,800 American lives. When the full scope of what had occurred reached division headquarters, Major General Cotter personally travelled forward to meet with the units involved. He found Desmond Watts in a battalion aid station, treating frostbite cases and supervising the care of wounded from the day's fighting. Watts still wore his mud-caked uniform, his glasses were cracked, and he looked utterly exhausted. Cotter approached him directly, brushing aside the attempts of junior officers to provide formal introductions. "Corporal Watts, I understand you're the man who came up with the wire detection technique." Watts stood, somewhat awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention of a general officer. "Yes, sir, but it wouldn't have worked without the men who strung the wire. Private Delacroix and the others, they're the ones who took the real risks." Cotter studied him for a long moment, this gangly medic with wire rimmer glasses who looked nothing like a warrior, but had perhaps saved more American lives in a single day than many combat units did in months. "Where did you learn to think like that, Corporal?" "That technique isn't in any manual I've ever read." Watts shrugged, an almost apologetic gesture. "I was a telephone lineman before the war, sir. I just thought about how we used to detect problems in the lines. Seemed like it might work for finding people in trees, too. Wasn't sure until we tried it." The general's expression was unreadable for a moment, then he laughed, a genuine sound of astonishment and respect. "A telephone lineman." "Of course. Sometimes the best solutions come from outside the system." He reached into his coat and produced a small notebook, scribbling quickly. "I'm putting you in for a silver star, minimum, possibly more, and I'm issuing orders for your technique to be disseminated immediately throughout the division, then the corps, then the entire European theatre, if I have anything to say about it. You've invented something genuinely new here, Corporal. That doesn't happen often in war." Watts looked uncomfortable with the praise, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Sir, I just did what seemed logical, and I still won't carry a weapon. My beliefs haven't changed about that." Cotter's expression turned serious. "I respect that, Corporal. You've proven that there are many ways to serve, many ways to save lives. You don't need a rifle to be a soldier." The wire detection technique did spread, exactly as Cotter had promised. Within a week, training bulletins were circulating through 1st and 9th Armies, explaining the method in detail. Signal Corps units were instructed to maintain supplies of wire specifically for counter-sniper operations. Infantry officers attended briefings where Delacroix, promoted to sergeant, demonstrated tree-climbing techniques and wire installation patterns. The technique was given an official designation in tactical manuals, the Watts method, a name that would have embarrassed the quiet medic from Pennsylvania if he'd known about it at the time. But more importantly, it saved lives beyond that single engagement in the Hürtgen. Similar wire grids were used in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, when German infiltrators were operating behind American lines. They were employed in the crossing of the Rhine when Wehrmacht snipers tried to contest the bridgeheads. They were even used in the final push into Germany itself, when fanatical holdouts attempted to slow the advance with harassment tactics. The technique's effectiveness lay not in technological sophistication, but in the simple physics of vibration and visibility. It required no special equipment beyond wire that was already abundant. It could be implemented by ordinary soldiers with minimal training, and it turned the enemy's careful preparation and concealment into liabilities rather than advantages. In the decades after the war, military historians and tacticians studied the Hürtgen Forest engagement as a case study in adaptive problem-solving under extreme conditions. The wire detection method appeared in training courses at infantry schools, in field manuals about unconventional tactics, in studies about innovation under combat stress. It became a teaching example of how solutions to military problems sometimes come from unexpected sources, how specialized civilian knowledge can be more valuable than military training, how desperation can drive creativity that doctrine never anticipates. Desmond Watts survived the war, though not without cost. He was wounded twice more before Germany's surrender. Once by shrapnel near Remagen, and once by small arms fire during the final weeks of fighting. Each time he refused evacuation until all wounded in his sector had been treated and removed. He never carried a weapon, maintaining his religious convictions even when officers and fellow soldiers urged him to arm himself for his own protection. After the war ended, he was awarded the Silver Star, as General Cotter had promised, along with 2 bronze stars with valor devices and a Purple Heart with oak leaf clusters. The citations praised his medical work, his courage under fire, and specifically mentioned the wire detection technique that had saved thousands of lives. At the award ceremony, held in a repurposed German beer hall in Bavaria in July 1945, Watts accepted the medals with quiet dignity, but immediately afterward returned to his unit to continue treating soldiers suffering from combat fatigue and adjustment disorders as the Army began its transition to occupation duty. He returned to Pennsylvania in December 1945, took up his old job as a telephone lineman, and rarely spoke about his war experiences. Those who knew him in civilian life had no idea that the quiet man climbing poles and stringing wire across farmland had once used that same wire to defeat an elite German sniper network. He married in 1947, raised 4 children, attended his Mennonite church faithfully, and lived modestly on a lineman's salary. When asked directly about the war, he would say only that he'd been a medic, that he'd tried to help people, and that he was grateful to have come home. The medals stayed in a drawer, shown to his children only when they asked, explained without embellishment or self-aggrandizement. To Watts, the wire trick had been common sense, not heroism. Real heroes, he insisted, were the men who'd climbed the trees to string it, who'd exposed themselves to enemy fire to implement an idea that might not have worked at all. Jimmy Delacroix, the Cajun private who'd been the first to volunteer for the wire stringing, survived the war as well, though he carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. The day in the Hürtgen haunted him, the memory of bullets passing so close he could feel their displacement of air, the sight of men falling from trees, the knowledge that every second he remained exposed was borrowed time. He returned to Louisiana in 1946, worked as a fishing guide in the bayous, and became something of a local legend for his tree-climbing abilities and his stories of the war. Unlike Watts, Delacroix talked freely about what had happened, perhaps needing to process the trauma through repeated telling. He'd describe in vivid detail the terror of moving through the canopy while snipers fired at, to him, the strange calm that had descended after the first few minutes, when fear had burned so hot it transformed into something like tranquility. He'd explain the wire technique to anyone who'd listen, always crediting Watts as the genius behind it, himself as just the fool brave enough or stupid enough to try it first. The German perspective on the engagement was preserved in post-war interrogation reports and memoirs published decades later. Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, the commander who'd planned the ambush, survived the war and was interviewed extensively by American military historians in the 1950s. He spoke candidly about the engagement, describing it as his greatest tactical failure despite the careful planning and favorable terrain. The wire detection system, he admitted, had been something German doctrine had never anticipated because it was so fundamentally simple. The Wehrmacht had trained its snipers to defeat infrared detection, to avoid creating patterns that artillery spotters could predict, to neutralize acoustic location methods. But they'd never considered that an enemy might simply wire the forest itself, turning trees into detection devices. Richter's assessment was professional and almost admiring. The Americans had demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that he believed had ultimately won the war, the willingness to discard conventional methods when faced with unconventional problems. The Hürtgen Forest engagement on December 8, 1944, ultimately changed very little in the broader strategic picture of the war. The forest remained a brutal killing ground for weeks afterward. The 28th Division, despite being saved from the sniper massacre, continued to suffer horrific casualties from artillery, mines, and conventional fighting. The breakthrough that headquarters had hoped for didn't materialize. Germany's defeat was inevitable by that point, guaranteed by overwhelming Allied material superiority, and the relentless Soviet advance from the east. But for the 5,000 men who'd been saved by a medic's wire trick, the engagement changed everything. They went home after the war, married, had children and grandchildren, built lives that would never have existed if they'd died in that forest. The ripple effects of those saved lives extended across generations, touching hundreds of thousands of people who never knew they owed their existence to communications wire and a telephone lineman's knowledge of vibration detection. The story raises questions about the nature of heroism and innovation in war. Watts was not a warrior in any traditional sense. He never fired a shot, never led a charge, never displayed the aggressive combat leadership that military culture typically celebrates. His contribution came from seeing a problem differently, from applying civilian knowledge to military circumstances, from having the courage to propose something that sounded absurd when explained. In many ways, his heroism was more profound than conventional battlefield courage, because it required imagination as much as bravery. The soldiers who strung the wire displayed a different kind of valor, the willingness to attempt something untested, to make themselves targets in service of an idea that might have been completely wrong. They climbed into trees while snipers fired at them because they trusted that a medic who talked about wire and vibration might actually be onto something worth dying for. The engagement also illustrates the strange, intimate violence of infantry combat. The German snipers and American soldiers were separated by mere yards, breathing the same cold air, seeing the same snow fall through the same trees. The Germans had names and families and reasons for fighting just as the Americans did. Some were volunteers who believed in their cause. Others were conscripts who simply wanted to survive. When they fell from trees, when they were cut down by machine gun, fire, they died as all soldiers die, suddenly and often meaninglessly, their individual stories ended by the collision of metal and flesh. The wire that revealed them was morally neutral, just copper and insulation functioning according to physical principles that cared nothing for politics or nationalism. It detected German snipers with the same reliability it would have detected American ones had the positions been reversed. The technique worked because physics works, indifferent to the justice or injustice of the causes that employed it. In the final accounting, Watts's wire trick represents something fundamentally hopeful about human nature, even in the context of war's brutality. It demonstrates that problems which seem insoluble often have simple solutions if we can break free from conventional thinking. It shows that specialized knowledge from any field can be valuable if we're willing to recognize it. It proves that desperation can spark creativity rather than merely paralysis. Most importantly, it illustrates that not all wartime innovations need to be about killing more effectively. Sometimes the most impactful innovation is about saving lives, about giving soldiers a chance to survive when they should have died, about sending people home to futures they wouldn't otherwise have had. That stupid wire trick, mocked when first proposed, saved 5,000 men from 200 snipers, not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through understanding how trees and wire and light interact, knowledge that came from climbing telephone poles in rural Pennsylvania, and translated, improbably, into survival in a German forest half a world away. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.